Welcome to the Hero Maker podcast. I'm Andrea Schreeman, writer-director EP, living in LA.
I'm Jennifer Morrison, and I currently serve as the Commissioner of Public Safety for the state of Vermont.
We are here to seek out and tell the full story of our friends who were murdered in college, Rachel Raver and Warren Fulton III.
We really need to make sure that their deaths were not in vain and that every possible lesson and improvement for the system can be squeezed from the retelling of the circumstances that ultimately led to the identification of their killer.
We have a really cool guest today. I'm really excited that I got to introduce you, Jen, to another one of my favorite people on the planet, Jared Seide, who's the executive director of an organization called Center for Counsel.
Yeah, I didn't know what to think when you told me about this guest that I didn't know anything about. And then a little while before we went live with him, I was cruising around their website and I could just feel the energy inside me picking up. I am so jazzed about the work they are doing, and there's such a need for it. I feel like you just gave me a big gift. So thanks, Andrea.
Yeah, and this will be a gift, hopefully, for our audience as well. An introduction to the work of Center for Counsel. Primarily, I think what we focused on in our conversation is their work in prison populations and their work in different police departments.
Well, to really focus on officer wellness, on the whole person wellness, it was fascinating and inspiring. And I'm excited for our listeners to hear what Jared had to say, because this is easy, as he said, to scale. And the possibilities are endless.
Awesome. Well, here we go. This is Jared Seide of Center for Counsel.
We've got a great tendency to other, and as we go about deciding who's with us and who's against us, there are a lot of things we look for: what we're wearing, how we're speaking, what our body language sort of tells others. And so in doing that, we kind of identify you're with me or you're against me, and we take sides really quickly. And it really conditions, I think, not only the way we hear each other, but how we form relationships, and then how culture is developed based on who we've decided is in our club and who's out of it. So,
and I think actually something that I've learned in my experience with a thing called Clubhouse. I don't know if either one of you have gotten on Clubhouse, which is just an audio app. It's a way for people to gather in audio. It's almost like you're all on a radio show together. And through podcasting is that taking away the visual element where people want to immediately judge and make determinations like, is that person safe? You know, is that person in my crew? Do they dress like me? Do they have a tat? Like any of that stuff. If that's not there, if it's just audio, people are more apt to bond and gather and feel safe because they're not going through that visual judgment phase. That's something I've noticed.
Yeah, I think connected to that, actually, Andrea, is the opportunity, and I think Jen probably is well aware of this. You know, we are cultivating relationships all the time, particularly in police community encounters. And so our ability to be skillful in understanding how those signs and signals affect our efficacy in cultivating positive relationships and creating more beneficial outcomes has a lot to do with how we understand we are showing up, who we are in the movie of those we are protecting and serving, and how they are affecting us and judgments we're making along the way. It's not an implicit bias conversation per se. It's really about those things we use to track our safety and others use to assess whether we are safe to engage with. And I think that's a really important area of skills to build that are often neglected in terms of law enforcement training, how it is we ask officers to sort of step out into communities that are overwhelming in a high stress state and not be resourced to be able to really navigate this very complicated interaction of who are you to me? Are you a friend or a foe? Are you an ally, or are you somebody that's going to give me a hard time? And vice versa.
Well, you know, it's interesting that you say that, because we were never properly resourced 30 years ago, 35 years ago. But back in the day, cops, particularly baby boomers, knew how to talk to people, because that's what you did. The baby boomers were such a large cohort. They queued up for everything. They stood in groups, they communicated. And what you just described is needed now more than ever, because we have an entire generation of young police officers who grew up communicating with their thumbs behind a keyboard, and they don't know how to read the nonverbal cues nearly as well as 30, 40 years ago. They don't necessarily have a lot of self-awareness about how they occur to people.
Mm-hmm.
And what you just said is so right on, now more than ever. Always should have been emphasized as much as the tactics and the many other skills that we have to train on. But the interpersonal communication, the meta messages, the nonverbals, as you were just saying, how you dress, how you stand, how you look at people, all those things are skills that we could benefit from.
I'm really glad you said that. And I think that it's a critical factor that often gets lumped into sort of touchy-feely mental health, unfit for duty, use of force kind of conversation. And it's really about skillfulness in cultivating these really critical communication skills for being most effective in serving communities and also doing our job well and feeling good about what we do. I think there's a great deal of growth, and there's an openness to this now that doesn't cast this as right or left or pro or anti anything. It's really about how do we become more effective at what we do and stay safe? How do we serve well and feel good about what we're doing? And how do we not die 10, 20 years sooner than we should because the stress is so overwhelming and we don't have any tools to navigate that? And I think it's both something to look at in terms of law enforcement training, but also when you're dealing with system impacted folks who are in an environment in which they are taught to behave certain ways, and then they go into prison. Many of them learn to harden in those ways of communicating with one another, this extraordinary toxic masculinity kind of culture that really is about intimidation, really is about being on guard and not showing any kind of vulnerability, and then expected to move back into communities and cultivate successful reentry with families where there are children and maybe there are spouses or loved ones. And all you've known is how to kind of bully your way through something and protect yourself and not get killed inside there. And so these skills are so critical in all directions for cultivating a more compassionate community.
Just sounds like it should be mandatory for offender reentry, right?
Yeah, I believe so. Absolutely.
That's awesome. So Jared, you just described offender population, and we were also talking about the law enforcement population. It sounds like you have experience in both. Can you just give us a quick window into the work that you've done over the last few decades, what you're focusing on now?
I'd be happy to. I'm so honored and pleased to be with you guys today. Really appreciate and very moved by what you're doing, and the telling of this story and its impact and also its implications just is incredibly important. So thank you for inviting me, and thank you for doing this work and doing it so beautifully. Our organization is called Center for Counsel. It's a Los Angeles-based nonprofit organization that provides programs and trainings that enrich and improve communication and well-being while fostering healthy, safe, compassionate, and thriving communities. We believe that community health has to begin with individuals who are healthy and well-resourced, and with relationships that are respectful and nourishing and generative. And so we work with schools, and we work with community-based organizations. We work with law enforcement agencies and healthcare providers. We work in prisons and in reentry, with faith-based groups and with businesses to provide these programs and trainings. They are intended to enhance mindfulness and individual well-being, as well as deepening communication and interpersonal relationships, so as to foster a more resilient and generative organizational culture and a more compassionate world generally. I think these are building blocks, and I think there are some very powerful, skillful means that are now evidence-based, that are not just about kind of feel-good, touchy-feely sort of things. These are real skills that are critical for keeping ourselves healthy, for keeping our relationships positive, and for building a positive culture. All of the programs that we do are based on the foundation of this practice of counsel, which is about coming together to listen and to offer regard and to share our stories. Just listening without judgment and speaking authentically immediately lessens isolation. It fosters empathy, being able to take the position of somebody else who is unlike you. And I think that leads to a decrease in cynicism, in burnout, in depersonalization, which is something that all first responders have to navigate as we have to move through very complicated situations, often depersonalizing those who we are serving, those who are depending on us. And it builds connections, it increases prosociality, and I think that ultimately it creates the conditions for compassion to emerge. And that's really the goal. It is therapeutic without being therapy. It is about fostering a safe and supportive and nourishing community-based resource without the stigma that often comes with mental health interventions or a sense that there's some religiosity about it where you have to join something. We have seen the incredible impact of implanting these practice groups in schools and businesses within police agencies before roll call or after roll call in small group huddles, they call them, inside prisons in small groups in the chapel or in education. And just having that makes folks feel like there's a resource that they then start to bring into their families. They're doing it at home. They're doing it sort of personal, unique ways and find themselves behaving more skillfully in ways that lead to, I think, not only better health, but a more connected and resilient community. And that's what everybody wants.
Jen, I'm sure you have a lot of questions and a lot to say.
It's a lot. Yeah.
I'm like, I need this. All my people need this in their life. Where has this been my whole career?
I have a question that's going to be a way
good because I'm
ahead.
spinning.
Yeah, Jared, the first thing that I want to ask you, which is what comes to mind, is so you're dealing with a prison population and you're working with officers. So my immediate thought is, what do you find helps with longevity and success in terms of the work you do once it's taken out into the family and the community? When you're not in that huddle or you're not inside and you want this to have lasting effects on a person's life and their community, what allows that to have the most longevity and be the most successful that you're finding?
Yes, that is the question. And it's the big question. It's the sort of the mystery that we all look at. And I believe, and I've come to believe in this profound, innate human goodness and the nourishment of connection and health. And I think once we taste it, once we find it, once it begins to be something that we find is easy to bring into our lives, whether it's our cellmate or our family or a partner on the job or a community member, something emerges that feels right. It is something we can do that brings us satisfaction and energy and nourishment and makes us feel good about ourselves and the job we're doing. And this is kind of a funny, strange little story, but as everyone I'm sure is aware, inside prisons, there's a lot of contraband moving back and forth, and there's certain people on the prison yard who are the people to go to if you want certain things. Folks in the maximum security prisons who have dropped into this work inside find that they are the go-to for people who have a conflict and need some support. So they're often the ones that someone will like, hey, you got to talk to that guy in the yard. You're having trouble with your family. You're having trouble in your life. You've got a conflict. Those are the guys who have the resource. And they walk in carrying this sense of, I'm the man at this point for providing folks with some skills because I've learned them and I've implemented them. And it feels really good to carry this. I'd rather be showing you how to take care of yourself and nourish your relationship with your estranged daughter than selling you drugs or connecting you with a gang, because I know this is going to benefit your family and it's really changed my life. And it may sound Pollyanna-ish, but we see over and over again how beneficial it is individually for folks to feel good about their ability to function, their ability to be successful and stay healthy, and to have connection and love in their lives. When compassion emerges, it's kind of infectious. And it's something that spreads.
It's a currency, just like cigarettes or other contraband, drugs, whatever it is. It's a currency.
Exactly,
I love
Jen.
it.
That's exactly right. Yeah. And it's surprising that that's the case. And there is a great deal of resistance, of course, to doing this work for all kinds of reasons, but particularly in law enforcement. I'd love to talk about that in a second because we need to be very careful about the language we use and how we present this. But once folks realize that this is something that we often ask officers after a few days, what kind of impact is this having? How is this going? They're like, it's not really doing very much for me. I mean, my wife tells me I'm a nicer person and my kids want to hang out with me and I'm actually sleeping better and I feel kind of good and I feel I have more energy and I just jogged another extra mile and people are saying hello to me, but it's not really doing anything. And that, this is really kind of a wonderful awareness that we carry so much that it feels great to unburden these things and to find that relationships improve. The resilience of our health improves when we can access these very basic skills that get really suppressed by the environments in which we work, this landscape of suffering in which we're constantly asked to operationalize.
Can you tell me a little bit about what counsel actually looks like? Like, for instance, if you had a police agency that said, we're open to this work, what would it look like? How many times do they meet? What's the commitment to really make this impactful?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. We have been very lucky or blessed or something to have met a moment where folks are more and more interested in experimenting with this. So from the state of California, from post agencies, now from IATLIST and others, and from the Department of Justice, the COPS office, we've gotten a great deal of support to iterate. And we have been able to refine the way in which we present this work. The program, and maybe I'll take a step back and just give you a sense of what POWER is. So we call it POWER, and it's an acronym that stands for Peace Officer, Wellness, Empathy, and Resilience. All those words are important in this. My friend Rich Gerling calls it the landscape of suffering. That officer wellness is a national crisis. It is absolutely unthinkable that we are asking officers to protect public safety and under-resourcing them such that conditions are so extraordinary. The life expectancy is anywhere from 10 to 20 years less than general population. John Biolenti found 21, 22 years less life expectancy. The physical health, the greater accumulation of stress-related illness and high incidence of injuries and all kinds of debilitating illnesses. Mental health.
And suicide.
Suicidality, 50% more likely than other professions. 3 to 4 times more likely than line of duty death. That's an extraordinary figure that talks about what mental health conditions look like with depression and anxiety, addiction, hypersexuality, not to mention domestic violence. 40% of law enforcement families experience domestic violence with addition of alcohol. Cognitive performance is diminished as a result of the enormous stress. And, we're talking about a climate that is toxic. The agency culture, the political scene, the community distress, the public chaos, these are all contributing to a really toxic environment. Justice issues have turned against law enforcement in all kinds of ways. The judgments, the resistance, the fear, the criticism, shame. It's really difficult, particularly officers of color who are working and really conflicted in environments where they feel, who am I? And where are the tools to navigate this complicated situation? The POWER program really looks at self-awareness first, self-regulation in the face of enormous stress and what that means, what it looks like, and how we can master that, how we pay attention to the environments in which we function and which we affect greatly, and how we cultivate these skillful relationships with ourselves in terms of our body and mind and emotions and spirit, and with others that we depend upon, our partner, our colleagues, our home life, and how we navigate that, and then ultimately how we meet those we are sworn to protect and serve. What does our relationship with those individuals look like? We are using this program to really introduce a model with 2 very intensive days of training followed by 3 months of weekly assignments where we are sending material to individual officers and we are having them meet in these small council huddles for about 45 minutes to 60 minutes a week. They do this in groups of 5 or 6. They are trained in our training to do this and to self-facilitate. We're asking them to look at awareness in terms of the physical awareness, how we encounter the world through our senses, what we can see and feel and hear, how we encounter other people, and then what's our relationship to food? How are we eating? How are we sleeping? How are we exercising? How are we moving? How are those things affecting us? And let's bring some awareness around that and really think about this because it needs to be deliberate. Even if it's fast food, we need to understand what that's doing to our gut biome and how it is to be throwing sugary or diet sodas into an environment where stress is created just by, slurping on your soda instead of something that's more nutritious and drinking enough water. Mentally, our thoughts, our perspectives, our inner dialogue, the inner voice that is constantly kind of criticizing us, the doom and dread, the catastrophizing. One lieutenant in Los Angeles talked about horribilizing, how we tend to horribilize things. And that's just a sort of habitual thing to horribilize. And what it means to do that. Emotionally, this emotional kind of roller coaster we're on, and emotion regulation as we deal with fear and joy and loneliness and grief and dread and love lost and things like this, these real human emotions, and where they go, because they don't just go away, they show up.
These are some of the topics that
this is awareness, yes.
Okay, so awareness is one of the areas that you ask in their self-reflection that's happening once a week for 45 to 60 minutes. What are some of the other areas that you ask them to focus on? And because I know that in my experience with counsel, the modality is really, there's listening. And then the other side of the listening is there's sharing. There's like a storytelling that can last a minute, but cops are really good at telling stories. My first question is, what are some of the other kind of areas and topics? And then how do you wrap it up? So you give them 2 days of training, you send them off to meet once a week for 3 months. And then at the end, I'm imagining there's some kind of like check-in.
I'm sorry, maybe I didn't. It's a much more in-depth process than that. And the program has a great deal more meat on it. It's been nationally certified. There's 35 hours of direct in-person contact and then 24 hours of asynchronous work that's done at home. The understanding of the autonomic nervous system is primary. How we understand sympathetic and parasympathetic tone and when fight, flight, freeze occurs, what that does. It means that we can react, but it also means our capacity for discernment is diminished. And so these are things to understand the science around. And we understand that in our 2-day workshop, but also every week there's a podcast, there's a journaling assignment, there's a ton of material that comes. And then there are discussions that are facilitated around questions of how these things are showing up. And so as we look at the way it is, we are unable to really listen to somebody when we're activated, that the executive function, our prefrontal cortex, when it shuts off because we're upregulated, is unable to hear, to create relationships, to create memories, to actually engage folks in such a way that we can hold abstract thought. This is a physiological phenomenon that we are experiencing when we are in sympathetic arousal. And we can interrupt that when it doesn't serve us. And it often doesn't serve us, and it often does serve us. So the cyclicity involved with moving from parasympathetic to sympathetic arousal is something to understand conceptually, to hear podcasts about, to discuss in groups, and to see really effectuated. And I would say that the counsel component is important. And I know, Andrea, you've been very involved in that one aspect of what it is we do, but so much material really needs to be presented on the front end, we have found with law enforcement. And then really over 3 months of weekly assignments, folks need to be able to go down those rabbit holes, and we give them a whole trail of podcasts. And, people like to geek out around this stuff, and there's a lot to learn. And then there's a lot to talk about in terms of how it shows up in my life. And so these counsel huddles that are created really support making a habit of exploring these things, not just knowing that it's there, but seeing how it's showing up this week in my life, and then hearing 4 or 5 other officers talk about how these things are showing up in their life. And with that, we begin to really integrate into our habitual day-to-day these really important resources and understandings, so that after 3 months, we come back twice. So their trainers are there for 2 full days of training in addition to the first 2. That's why it's 32 hours actually of training that we give them over 3 months. But at the end of 3 months, nobody wants to stop. Nobody wants to end the process. So these huddle groups continue at the agency because they're a resource. They're not employee assistance. It's not mental health problems. It's not an expert telling you that you're broken. It's a group of folks who are going through what you're going through, really breaking down, how it is, what your strategy was.
It just moves to the coffee shop or the donut shop or the
parking lot or anywhere.
diner.
Yeah. I think that being trained well, tactics can be top-notch in your training. And if you do not have the ability to discern how those tactical skills are employed and sustained, they can be ineffective at best or really dangerous at worst. And I think it's critical that there be something like this. And when folks experience what it is to integrate in this way, not just in the times we visit them, but in this ongoing self-facilitated group, you begin to really integrate these ideas and I think come to a place where you can be more skillful in doing the work that you do in the world and navigating the work-life balance that will keep you healthy and keep your life going as well.
There's a long conversation out there about warrior versus guardian, right? And yes, both and, because you can't go in warrior mode as your baseline. You can't. You need to get back to homeostasis and try to be there as much as possible, right? But when it's go time, it's go time. And you have to have the skills and you have to use the tactics quickly, because the longer a physical interaction drags out, the more likely someone or both are going to get hurt. When it's go time, you have to be highly skilled. However, ... as you know, the police actually use force on a citizen in less than 1% of the encounters that they have with the public. So 99+% of the time, it's everything else but your tactics and use of force skills that are going to make you successful. So it's all about the good communication. It's all about being able to build trust. It's all about being relatable and approachable. And this is very clearly a good match to the work you're doing about making people aware of how they occur to people, of making them listen sincerely, being able to reflect back and meet people where they are. This piece of training is relevant to more than 99% of the job that we do, whether that's with our peers or our supervisors or the public. So I'm really, really jazzed when I was watching your video clips on your website and stuff. I was like, yes, I was like cheering watching them.
Thank you. And, Jen, I know that you are very well aware of 21st century policing and what that commission was identifying as critically important. This ideal of procedural justice that is in the number one pillar is about how we protect and serve. And it's really predicated on the fact that communities feel that they are being listened to. And we're not teaching folks how to listen well. And yet we're expecting that these relationships will emerge as a result of good listening and folks feeling heard. And it's not even about communities feeling they're getting things done their way. It's about somebody cares enough to listen to them, and that can be demonstrated. And so when that is evident in an encounter, it's a huge plus, and it really advances the goals of policing in a really important way that have everything to do with the job and everything to do with what it is we're there to do, but are not supplied with a manual on how to do this. And a lot of folks are so overwhelmed by this climate and this toxicity and the stress that their capacity to be relational is really diminished. And so how do we turn that back on? What are the things we can do? I've had officers talk about how in a go time moment, as they were running towards something, when they could take a breath and realize the door flies open, their feet hit the ground. And in that moment, they kind of like pulled themselves back into reality and turned on something that created a discernment that prevented somebody from getting killed because they were going for it. They had an idea of what was happening, but they weren't paying attention. It was, I know this, I got this, let me go. And it was a complete tunnel vision, auditory exclusion kind of moment of, I don't care what's happening. I know what I think is going on here. And in just regulating enough to see, wait a minute, this may not be the best solution. Lives were saved and careers maybe were saved. And his story of this is really compelling because it was an application of a very simple skill that took a millisecond to activate. This is a very incendiary situation, but if we can zoom out and see what's really going on here, we'll be more effective in serving this moment well and avoiding a potential catastrophe.
And being safer, too.
And being safer.
I mean, that self-regulation and the ability to go to the balcony a little bit is really, really, really going to result in fewer uses of force and fewer injuries to police officers, fewer injuries to the public. So, I mean, again, I have to come back to the fact that the actual amount of times that the police use force versus the number of times they encounter the public on the daily are small, very small. But of course, a lot, almost all of the public narrative focuses around a small slice of those very few use of force encounters. So we have to get those right. And being able to bring more tools to the toolbox, not the ones that are on your tool belt, but the ones that you're talking about building.
Yeah.
That's what we need. We need more of this.
The Williamson County Cultural Arts Commission of Franklin, Tennessee wishes to thank our men and women in blue who help us deliver safe and fun family and community cultural events year-round, including one of the only authentic bluegrass festivals in the country. Bluegrass Along the Harpeth takes place every July and at the Williamson County Fair in August and at the annual Tennessee International Independent Film Festival. Check out our full calendar of events at wccac-tn.org.
One of the things that we're encountering in our investigative work around our friends' deaths is the impact of trauma on memory. And what we're noticing is that we're getting multiple accounts of singular situations. Like we had an officer who worked on one of the associated events who forgot or didn't mention that the victims were raped. He was like, I'm not sure. Maybe they were, but I don't recall that. And then we were contacted by a family member of one of the rape victims who said, I was horrified to hear that this officer didn't remember that. And I thought, it's 30 plus years, and that's how memory works. And he's seen thousands, if not tens of thousands of horrific events, this police officer. The fact that he doesn't remember that isn't shocking to me. That's just one example. We've had these various perceptions of singular events. I know you're not a memory expert, but I just wonder if you have anything that you can contribute in terms of trauma and how it impacts perception and memory.
You know, I think you've kind of described what the limits of my understanding of this, and I've tried to mention some of what we know about the importance of cyclicity in dealing with our autonomic nervous system. The executive function, the place where we form memories and recall memories, we create relationships, we create poetry, we set goals. These are all things that really depend upon parasympathetic tone. And that is is a physiological condition that we often can't maintain because we don't have skills or because we're eating poorly and sleeping poorly and can't manage our stress. And when we're in that place, we are not effective. And memory is one of the things that really suffer as a result of our inability to sustain that parasympathetic tone. We talk about that in terms of relationality, in terms of insight, in terms of the capacity to really listen and to behave with compassion. And compassion is kind of my lane for what does that look like? How do we understand compassion? It's not empathy or sympathy or pity. It's not just about how you feel. It's about what you do and how you are effective in what you do for yourself and others. So this condition enables us to create outcomes that are aligned with our ethos, with our morals, our sense of what it is we want to do in the world. And I think it makes us feel good about the story we're telling about who we are and who we are in the world. I'm sort of skirting around this because I'm not a neuroscientist, but there's an enormous amount of neuroscience that supports the fact that folks are, as Jenna said, much more effective when they utilize these tools that don't fit in the toolkit, but that really increase their ability to discern and to be strategic and also to be able to understand the story and then retell the story of what has happened when it comes time to be reporting. And really even looking back on your whole career, what have I done and what's been its meaning? And is it aligned with who I am as a human? And these kind of conversations really help us integrate in ways that are more sophisticated than what we do when we're in that go time, fight, flight, freeze, sympathetic arousal state. And understanding how to navigate in and out of that makes us more effective. And ultimately, I think will increase our ability to retain information and tell an accurate story.
Does it surprise you at all that certain people deeply involved in the same incident have different recollections of a fact or a moment or something in that case?
Yeah, absolutely not. And we're conditioned to see things that confirm our bias and confirm what it is we're thinking we're seeing. There are all kinds of ways that a human walking towards me is going to be perceived by me differently than someone standing next to me because of how I've been conditioned to read their body language, their facial expressions, the sort of tone of voice, the energy in the room, whatever that means. We will all have our own kind of approach and understanding that self-awareness is where we begin to become more effective in being aware of the surroundings. And so there is a laboratory going on here, and this reflective contemplative process of really looking to what is arising in me cultivates the capacity to see what is arising in you and what's happening here in this circle, in this community. I think these are really important building blocks. Certainly when we work with incarcerated population, there are folks who are also under-resourced and learn ways to function in society based on developing the capacity to be more aware and have greater insight, and therefore cultivate an ability to make choices and behave in a more pro-social and more effective way when they get out. I think the transformation that some folks are able to engage in the rehabilitative process is really striking. And I think we have seen as a result of what we have brought into prisons, some extraordinary and inspiring transformation of individuals and their capacity to be of benefit as agents of change when they get out. And that's because they've done this work inside, and the work they've done on themselves is then translated to the work that they do in relationship and community. And I think that's the same for officers.
I've got so much flooding in. And what you just mentioned was this ability to transform. That is to have your truth, first of all, really resonate as authentic and have it be heard, right? Have it be received or released in some way so that I can have that trauma kind of separate from me in some way so that I can then have the space to become something new or welcome in new ideas. There's something about being able to take those experiences of truth and trauma and just have them be lifted so that transformation is available.
I'm not sure they're lifted. So, I mean, I don't know. I'm not a neuroscientist, obviously, but I have a lot of experience with the constant exposure to depravity and the daily layering on of insults to your psyche, to your soul, to who you are, because the things that you encounter over and over on a patrol shift don't align with your values, don't align with who you are as a human being. And so there's this up in your brain, there are all these things that you saw, heard, smell, had to write down, had to photograph, and they're swirling and they're not resolved. When you can properly process them, and I think that process is very different for different people, but it sounds like your skill set, Jared, your work would be really sentinel in helping people process that blender full of stuff, stimuli that are up there, insults. When they are dealt with, and to some degree, Andy, when you are able to file them away They've been processed, they've been honored, they go in a file in your brain somewhere. I don't think you release them and they're gone, but you make room for new understanding and new meaning as you process these experiences and you file them away. At least that's sort of been my experience, but that they'll just sit there and, you'll dream about it. It'll pop up while you're in the shower until somehow you're able to wrestle that experience into the file cabinet somewhere.
Well, there's the willingness to work with it and allow it to be dreamed. Kind of like when Lisa was talking about her, while she was in the experience of her event where she was being raped and escaping.
Stabbed.
Yeah. Once she got to a place where there was another person there who was helping to kind of get her to safety, that's when she started to hallucinate and relax and went into a whole different state. Once you retired, Jen, you've talked about this, that's when you started to allow yourself to dream. You weren't on the streets anymore, and to start to work with that material and file it properly and all that stuff. All I was talking about releasing was trauma. That's what I meant. Anyway, this is a bunch of clay on a wheel, Jared. And you were starting to go into prison population conversation, which is, we'd love to hear about as well. God, I wish we had all day, but go. What's next, Jared, based on what we've added to the conversation?
I think there's a really important conversation around post-traumatic growth that I think is really valuable and relevant. And I think folks have done some really important work on what that means. I don't know that we discard our trauma. I think we can grow through it, and it can be something that's incorporated like compost, which is pretty darn smelly and awful, and yet becomes the key to new growth. And in understanding what that process means to take this sort of the dissolution of this substance and have it be something that helps us grow is really important. I really go back to the teaching of skills, because I think that's where I can have an impact. I will say that in my world, we have to be really skillful to avoid really dangerous pitfalls, particularly in terms of first responders and navigating what officers are confronting all the time. Compassion-based encounters take us to the edge of ethical conduct, and they force us to navigate in a terrain that's often really perilous. I think that it's really critical that we study this sort of inner ecology of how things are moving within us, so that we understand that when we're on the edge, when we're on that edge, we can navigate more skillfully, and we can move from health into a kind of growth mode rather than slipping into pathology. Joan Halifax, one of my teachers, and has done a great deal of work on compassion, talks about these 5 edge states because we want folks to be altruistic. We want altruism to be a virtue. And yet, despite our caring and sacrifice, there is pathological altruism. There is that hero complex that has us do too much so that we're actually hurting ourselves and we're ineffective. We want people to be empathic. Empathy is something that we really encourage, and yet empathic distress and fatigue often comes when we go down the rabbit hole with somebody. We can't do anything and we're paralyzed. We want people to work with integrity, but moral outrage can really trap us. We want people to be engaged, but burnout is the other side of that. So understanding that all of these things that lead to some really awful outcomes are not because people are bad or doing bad things. It's because folks are really committed to doing good things, but are under-resourced in the skillfulness that is necessary to really be working on this edge and mining this terrain well. And so an understanding of that and a real attention to that, I think, will equip us with ways to move from this sort of pathological state into something that's more healthy. And I think we can really make some progress by innovating in ways we train folks, both in terms of law enforcement training, but also these other sort of trainings that we're involved with. And I'm happy to talk about stuff going on inside prisons if you like.
If a police chief or someone who works in the law enforcement setting was listening to our conversation right now, and they were as jazzed about it as I am, how do they get started in this work? What do they do?
It's a question of reaching out. Someone became aware of our work who's a philanthropist in Jacksonville, Florida, and said, Jacksonville Sheriff's Office really needs this. We've had staff suicides that are beyond anything we've seen before. Folks are taking their lives in ways that we just can't sustain. We need something now. And so we went to Jacksonville, Florida, and we trained up the folks, and it has led to an incredible transformation there in Florida. This is something that is exportable. We are very pleased to have the Department of Justice working with us now to elevate the successes we've seen. We've had these wonderful videos of our LAPD friends talking about what has changed in them. The state funding is a great thing, but when there are local philanthropists that support local law enforcement, it's easy to figure out what it would cost to train up a cohort of 25 officers and train them to be trainers for the rest of the agency. So we're really interested in scaling this now with agencies that are feeling the need for it. And there are all kinds of ways to activate resources. Here in California, there's post reimbursement for agencies that want to apply that way, but in other states, there are other mechanisms for funding, and certainly there's always private funding that's available to make one of these programs happen. There's an enormous amount of resources that are sitting right there, and this 3-month program. And it's very much available to any law enforcement agency that's interested in reaching out. So hit us up through the website, and I'd be happy to have somebody respond quickly and talk about how we could bring it to your community.
The other thing that I saw on your website that I wanted to ask you about was, we talked earlier about how now more than ever we need to cultivate trust and relationships with the community. And I mean, the police derive their authority from the public trust. I saw on your website about, I guess, the concept of counsel to bring communities and their law enforcement closer together. I wonder if you've done any work around a critical incident, or when there's been a particularly high profile break in trust between, say, a community of color or some portion of the community and their law enforcement agency. Do you guys do any work around that?
Again, it's a great question, Jen. Thank you for asking that. I think that the work we've been able to do, bringing, we call it cops and communities circling up, when that happens, it is magical. It's extraordinary. You wouldn't expect it to happen. We don't start there. I would not invite a group from Black Lives Matter and LAPD to sit down, having not met each other, and open up to each other. That's just ridiculous. There's so much history. Each group is carrying so much trauma, and in many cases doesn't have the skills to have the conversation. But what we cultivate in bringing this online for ourselves, for our partners in our environment, is the capacity to think about who's not in our circle and how do we welcome them in. We always place an empty chair in these circles because we realize there's some folks who can't sit with us right now, who we don't want sitting with us right now, but eventually it'll be critical that we include them in this as well. And so we've had a few opportunities to bring groups together, and often the day will begin with officers with their hand at their, at their sidearm, just kind of making sure that nothing is happening. All right. And same with some of the community members kind of like not wanting to say a thing. And you begin to see through the storytelling, someone will tell a story and someone will go sort of have this moment of like, I didn't expect you to say that. Well, I have a story too. And then through the sharing of our human experience and the cultivating of our common ground, we see this aspirational beloved community, this idea of beloved community emerge, where we don't agree with each other. We may not vote for the same people or do the same things, but somehow we have respect for each other because in the story, we recognize this shared humanity and the fact that all of us need somehow to deal with each other in order for our kids and the next generation and generations to come to thrive. And so when that is activated, it's really miraculous. I wouldn't call the folks into the circle until we have worked with them individually. And when we have, we create these teams. And once they have begun to get comfortable with one another, sending in 3 officers and 3 community activists into another community to talk about what they have learned about each other and how to work with a situation is incredibly inspiring. The potential for scaling this is enormous. We're at the beginning of funding mechanisms to do more of these things, and I'm really excited to see more of it iterate. There's a video on our website called Cops and Communities Circling Up, which is one of these amazing afternoon experiments in which from beginning to end you see incredible transformation, but the applicability to incendiary situations that arise around the country is enormous, and the ability to send a team into those situations to hold these conversations is something that we are desperately wanting to have the funding in place to do before the next incident requires it. It's part of our work now to build that capacity and those resources.
That is amazing. I know that probably all of your participants have their own success stories, but in the time that you've been doing the work of counsel, do you have any favorite success stories, either with individuals or organizations?
It's probably worth noting something about the folks, the incarcerated folks as well, to round out the conversation. But I will say that there are some officers who talk about a traffic stop that would have gone very differently had they not had this training. Walking up on a car and feeling like I'm bringing something and this community member has got something going on, and all of a sudden we're at level 10 with each other and something is going to happen. And then I kind of, he says, realized if I took a breath and took a step back and said, excuse me for a minute, I need to kind of reset and recognize the situation, he could make it go in a very different direction. And he's done this over and over again. He's kind of surprised at himself that when you sort of check yourself and that you come into a situation with a different capacity for listening, outcomes change dramatically. I think that over and over again, we hear from officers that they have found moments to integrate into their work life. But more importantly, I think for them, what they're seeing is blood pressure that was out of control and medication that wasn't quite working, all of a sudden unnecessary. They're seeing sleeping through the night. They're seeing interest in exercise that was not part of what they expected would be their outcome. Doctors saying, I don't know what you're doing, but you don't need to take this medication anymore because your blood pressure is under control. So whatever it is you're doing, keep it up. And the fact that folks are healthier, to me, is kind of more important than anything, that you've given so much to this career. You expect to be a grandparent and have a retirement, and you're looking at these statistics where, folks are dying in their 50s and barely make 60 years old. Maybe you can change the statistic a little bit by taking this on. And a lot of folks have so far in the short amount of time we've been offering this training. I think folks have created new outcomes for themselves that are going to lead to some really significant and important life experiences in retirement, because they've been able to navigate the impact of stress on their health. So that's just a little bit of a window. I don't know, Andrea, where our time is, but I'm happy to talk a little bit about folks we're working with inside prisons if you like.
I just want to say that I love what you said about check yourself, because one of the things I used to counsel some of my young, hard charging, but not self-regulated patrol officers was check yourself before you wreck yourself. And so when you said that, that immediately clicked for me. But I know Andrea wants to talk about the incarcerated folks. And I noticed that on your staff, you have some folks who you came to know because of the work you were doing inside prison facilities. So obviously there's some success stories there.
It's been amazing to see. And in fact, we did some videos, I think in 2015, 2016, a couple of lifers who strolled into a session covered with signifiers of their gang involvement and saw a very mixed and diverse group and kind of went, whoa, what am I getting into here? Understanding that the rules on the prison yard were going to have to be suspended for me to even sit with you, let alone share things with you. To watch lifers and LWOPs, folks with life without the chance of parole, actually kind of drop into, I am at a point in my life where I need to change. There's some things I need to look at about myself. There's some material for me to work with. And I want to do this with this group because I feel like I can trust it. Because that guy over there shared a story that was so moving to me. He didn't need to share it. And it's sort of encouraging me to share my story. And then over the course of time, folks develop. And 3-4 years later, they go to their board hearing and the commissioner says, you don't belong in here. You belong outside helping folks. And so many of them, many of them, lifers, have gone to their board of parole hearing kind of conference and gotten a grant of parole, come out, and a couple are working on our staff now, and they're extraordinarily effective. Their lives, their advanced degrees, they became substance abuse counselors, they got jobs. I was able to hire them onto my staff because they're so valuable. And now what they're doing, as we go in and meet with wardens in prisons and go in and inspire folks inside and then set up these programs, is living testament to the fact that folks who are ready to make a change and have the tools to do it and are able to take the time to really dig in and develop that kind of insight, well, they do have the capacity in many cases to start a new chapter of their lives. And something that they did when they were 20 years old or 25 years later is something that they have been able to integrate, that it's not something they have jettisoned, the trauma of that, the harm that was caused, their ability to recognize who has been harmed by their action, not just the victim, but the families and the community, what that means, and their commitment to working to heal, and also to recognize who has harmed them and how they have been caught in a spiral in which they have been abused in all kinds of ways that they've become much more aware of. It's a really extraordinary thing to see happen, and their interest in taking this and using it, as I mentioned, as an agent of change is first evident on the prison yard, because the culture shifts dramatically when a bunch of folks who are rivals, who are involved, active folks engaged in violence on the yard, leave a room friendly, talking to each other, convivial. And then when something happens, they're not interested in getting involved in any kind of violence because they've heard a story that's moved them, and you can't unring that bell. I know who you are. You've lived a life that's similar to mine. I'm not interested in what this culture is doing to make us enemies because I've seen your humanity. And that changes. And when folks are involved in these groups and behave this way, the entire yard notices. Everybody notices that something is different. The correctional officers are kind of always coming out saying, what are you doing in there? Why are folks different? Is this real? Could it be real that folks I saw behaving one way a couple months ago are now different people? Is it even possible? And, I can't say that everybody who goes into these groups becomes a new person, but I can say that there's some incredible transformation that occurs as a result of folks who really have done the work. We have received all kinds of awards, Innovation in Corrections Award from the American Correctional Association. We started out in a couple of prisons. We're now in 29 prisons. We have 4,000 plus folks who are sitting in these circles. But more importantly, they're taking what they're learning and they're doing it on the yard with their cellmate, other folks. When there's a family visit, they do it with their families. When they get out, all they want to do is go back into their community and not set people straight, but hold space for these conversations to emerge. They become sort of the elder that's missing in many of these communities by saying, I have the resources to sit with you and to really unpack some of this together. And maybe that will lead to a different outcome in terms of what you will do next. And I feel like that's just a critical benefit to society. If we can take their incarceration and when they've paid their debt to society, have them become agents of change in affecting those conditions that were so damaging for them when they're back in community, what a wonderful thing. What a real fulfillment of the sort of R in CDCR. Rehabilitation, California Department of Corrections added the R because it really is incumbent upon us to address this idea of rehabilitation for those who are willing. And it's not everyone, but there are a large portion of folks who are incarcerated who are ready to make that change. And if we can activate them, if we can provide those tools and then set them on a path where they can be part of the healing, that's an incredible benefit to society, as well as a really inspiring story to see happen.
We talk about the ripple effect of a traumatic event. So in our case, it was the rape and murder of our friend Rachel and her boyfriend Warren. And the ripple effects we've talked about on previous episodes about all the people that case touches. But I think about for every person that you train who can then go replicate or at least create better, healthier relationships with 3 people, whether it's a cellmate and a couple family members or something, like the ripple effect is growing. And maybe it's not the intensity, but there's really positive pro-social skill sets being rippled out away from each one of these people who complete your training.
I think it's true. And I think that we understand something about criminogenic factors that are dynamic, that can be affected. And, our program looks at, with research we developed with the RAND Corp and with UCLA, indicators of these measures of criminogenic factors having to do with insight and empathy and pro-social behavior and pro-social friends. And we see these changes consistently as a result of this dosage of programming. And that's really inspiring. It's predicated on this idea that self-awareness and attentive listening leads to the capacity for empathy and insight. And that lays the groundwork for something to emerge that looks like compassion in a productive next chapter. It's all about how we understand what's going on in our autonomic nervous system, how we're activating the parasympathetic nervous system in times that we need to be more effective and discerning. And these tools that are not, you don't need to go, buy them on Amazon or spend a lot of money on them. They're tools that we possess, and they're forms of wisdom that come to us through years and years of insight. And these are things we can really tap and integrate if we do it well and we have the investment and resolve. So I'm excited to continue this. I think it's important to point out that what we're doing inside prisons, what we're doing with law enforcement and others, are all moving simultaneously. They're all kind of joining each other in a great stream. And it's about developing the capacity to live in a world in which there is more wholesome relationality and greater potential for compassion to emerge. And I think that's a really exciting and important priority for all of us.
Well, it is. And I just want to say one last thing about what you talked about in these prison groups, where rivals, like people who are wired to be in conflict with one another. You're not going to go shiv a guy that you just poured your heart out to, or who you just were in relation with. And now you, as you said, you have something started there. It might not be a friendship, but you have seen their humanity. The same is true in our communities.
Absolutely.
And the same is true about reducing violent encounters. So the more these skill sets, no matter who the target population is, the more these skill sets become part of the tapestry of our community, the less violence we're going to have.
Jen, I also want to say that when you talk about the ripples, that guy who chose not to shiv the rival gets out and becomes the elder in society that's talking to the 14-year-old and the 13-year-old about what to do with all of this overwhelm and anger and trauma and parents who are neglecting you and gang life. That's the guy you want really encouraging this positive behavior before it turns into criminality. When someone's tagging and looking for some way to navigate what's happening in community, you want that guy who learned that and came out committed. We all can talk about this. We can have podcasts and, kind of aspire to these things. But when you have real life transformation and you activate these folks to go back into community and to really be a force for good and agents of change, I think that's when you see real kind of profound culture change.
I wish you Godspeed in the work you're doing. This is just fantastic. I feel so hopeful about the future. Where were you 33 years ago when I started my career 32 years ago?
I want to reflect on what you just said about the agents of change and having them be from within. I heard you say that you're also activating law enforcement to then teach other law enforcement the skills that they're learning, and that set up to have an exponential difference. And I'm in my head, I'm kind of hearing it as the tipping point of compassion, a wave of compassion.
Absolutely.
And I'm so happy that I got to introduce two of my favorite people in the world to each other today. And I'm sorry that we have to cut this so short. It feels short, but there's so much information and excitement.
And
Thank you.
I will encourage folks, if you want to learn more, to check it out. We've got this book called Where Compassion Begins, because I think that is really it. Where compassion begins is with the simple act of listening, of being able to take a backward step and really be able to cultivate this. It's not hard to do, and it's such a critical and inspiring thing to be committed to. So we're doing it, and we love to be connected with you all, having these important conversations, and hopefully more and more folks will see that while it's important to reflect and grieve and be with the heartbreak, to be able to understand what the lessons are to learn to move forward, it's also a moment where there's capacity for us to do some things, so that the next sort of iterations of folks who are coming up through community and hoping to find some kind of resource to live productive lives have resources implanted, both in terms of what's happening for them in their communities, but also law enforcement and education and businesses, et cetera, that the system begins to change to support more positive relationships and more health, such that we don't get these outcomes repeating themselves over and over again. We're deeply committed to that. I would encourage anybody to find out more about. It's not just us, of course. There's so many organizations doing great work, but I'm happy to have folks learn about what we do and others like us.
How do they find you?
Center for Council, and it's CENTERFOR. Council is COUNCIL. It's not counseling. It's like a council, because it's a group of folks who are gathered together. Centerforcouncil.org is where we are, where we live on the web, and there's tons of, as you said, videos and evaluation reports and stuff like that. And I'm always eager to talk with folks who have an interest in this work and bringing it to new communities. And I really appreciate the platform you all are creating for this important conversation to happen and being able to be a part of this. So thank you very much for the invitation.
This was such a wonderful surprise, and I'm so happy to have met you.
Thank you so much, Jen. And thank you, Andrea, for putting us together.
Yeah. Be well.
Thanks. You too.
I feel like we could have talked to Jared for a really long time, and we barely scratched the surface. And I felt like he probably appealed deeply to your geek side. I was like imagining, Jen, that you were like, oh my God, like I could get a whole education in this, and my officers could get an education in this, and then we could integrate it. I know you must be flying high, but what do you see as possible by integrating the work of Center for Counsel?
The possibilities are endless. I see a deep need in two categories that are, right in my wheelhouse right now. The first is around officer wellness, around the integrative aspect of teaching police officers skills that we don't currently focus on, at least not much, that are going to keep them healthier and happier, which will lead to better policing, and that it's skill sets that will help them interact with the community in a way that is going to build better relationships, build more trust. The other area that I felt really excited about was in Vermont, we focus a lot on, in our correctional system, we don't have prisons. We call them correctional institutions or correctional centers. There is also an emphasis on rehabilitation and providing people with skills. And just listening to the stories that he had and seeing on their website that some of their staffers came from inside serving life sentences and are now out in the community. I mean, they've got street cred with people who, if you tried to talk to them and say, I want to help you be more self-aware and do some really deep active listening and grow your compassion, they'd not be interested at all, right? But these people have street cred, and they are able to replicate the skills that they learned and teach them out, the ripple effect we were talking about. So I see almost infinite possibilities with this type of work. Not to mention that one of the things you and I have talked about with Bill Bratton and with others is that, the temperature in the room around some of these conversations between the police and the community has been so hot, and it's really been depersonalized. It's been ad hominem attacks that are not about facts. They're about feelings and emotions and trying to discredit the speaker who's speaking on the other side of an issue, as opposed to putting facts on the table and having respectful civil discourse and finding a path forward. And I feel like this focus on self-regulation and really trying to make sure that you're in a space where you can do effective listening and lean in and hear the other person's perspective to activate your empathy. Like, that's the only way we're going to solve some of these really sticky problems that we have right now in our communities. So I think what we talked about today is I'm going to be noodling on it in my head all day. I love it. I love that you brought this guy to our program, and I love the work they're doing. So home run, Shreems.
Thanks. Yeah, the work is amazing, and I'm really glad that it's landing for you and that you're seeing these possibilities. And my only hope right now is that it gets beyond the 500,000 people that you represent in Vermont, that it can get beyond the borders of Vermont, because
hey, we're
you all have
650,000.
Sorry, 650. But it just feels like there's a beautiful incubator in Vermont, and you've had a lot of impact there. And I want to make sure that it gets beyond the borders of your beautiful state too. And I know he's working with the DOJ, and that will be helpful, but just putting that out there, Jen, that yes, of course, protect your peoples, but let's radiate.
Agree. And I hope that our listeners will really think about engaging with this type of work. In fact, I got to make sure Ronell knows, because this is right up his alley too.
Awesome. Thanks to sound mixer and podcast producer Michael Doherty, sound designer Andy Bill of Submachine Audio, and graphic designer Jungleen Bay. Thanks also to me, Hero Maker director and producer Andrea Shreeland. Please subscribe to the show where you listen to podcasts and take a moment to rate us. It really helps the podcast grow. We're also on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at The Hero Maker Pod. Want to collaborate or suggest a guest? Please email us at media@theheromakerpodcast.com. The Hero Maker Podcast is a production of Prudent Pictures. Thank you so much for listening.